The doors did not open, they exploded. Shimmering glass panels of Rocky Heights Bank in downtown Denver banged against the stopper as if shoved by the wind of war itself. The sharp sound cracked through the lobby like a rifle report. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Fingers hovering over phone screens stiffened. The stale hum of fluorescent lights seemed to vanish into silence. Every head turned toward the figure who had entered, and the air itself seemed to pull tight. Black leather boots struck the marble floor, not in haste, but in command. Each step was measured, deliberate, echoing across the room with a cadence that no one could mistake. The man was built like stone dressed in ceremony, full-dress uniform pressed to the sharpness of blades, rows of ribbons glinting under the lobby lights, a scar cutting across his jaw like a permanent signature of battle. Lieutenant General Marcus Harlan did not ask permission to enter. He took the room. No one in the bank, not the smug young manager, not the teller, not even the laughing customers who had been recording a frail old man just minutes before, knew what to do. Conversations suffocated. The room became a chamber of judgment. Harlan did not look at them. He did not acknowledge the whispers, the startled gasps, or the sudden nervous coughs. His eyes moved with the precision of a rifle scope, locking onto the bench near the window. There sat the old man, Elijah Mercer, 78 years old, shoulders squared despite the ache of age. A cane rested between his knees, like a silent rifle stacked in formation. He had not moved since he had been humiliated, mocked, and nearly dragged out as a fraud. His face was expressionless, but his presence unyielding, heavy, immovable, filled the space. And then the impossible happened. Harlan stopped. Before the entire bank staff, security, customers, even the smug manager whose smirk had vanished the moment those boots hit marble, the three-star general drew himself tall, spine rigid, shoulders broad. With the crack of thunder contained in a single gesture, his hands snapped to his temple. He saluted. The sound of leather palm meeting steel visor resonated like a gunshot. It was not merely respect. It was a declaration. Gasps rippled. A coffee cup slipped from someone's trembling hand and shattered against the floor. Elijah Mercer lifted his eyes. For a moment, he looked confused, as though surprised that anyone remembered. Then, slowly, with the solemn grace of decades of drilled muscle memory, he rose. His cane tapped against the marble. His knees strained, but his posture remained that of a soldier. He returned the salute. The world in that bank collapsed inward. Every mockery, every chuckle, every sneer of fraud evaporated under the weight of that single exchange. And then Harlan's voice cut the silence. Low, sharp, every syllable like shrapnel. "Who here," he demanded, "called Colonel Elijah Mercer a fraud?" The words detonated. No one answered. Not at first. The young teller swallowed hard, eyes darting to the manager. The security guard shifted uneasily, as if reconsidering every order he had taken. Customers stared at the floor, shame pinning them where they stood. The manager, Travis Holt, tried to force air into his lungs. His lips twitched. His smirk, once glued to his face, was gone, replaced by the pallor of a man caught in the act of spitting on a ghost he didn't know could bleed. Elijah Mercer said nothing. He hadn't said much at all. Not when they laughed at him, not when they mocked his discharge papers, not when they called him a fake. He hadn't needed to. Because now the truth stood in front of them, in boots and brass and ribbons that told a story far heavier than words ever could. The customers watched, transfixed, unable to tear their eyes from the spectacle. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the scene had been set in motion hours earlier. That behind the quiet dignity of an old man had been a history of battlefields and classified operations. That the coin he carried in his coat pocket, a small silver disc engraved with an eagle gripping arrows, had the power to silence entire war rooms, though the bank's manager had dismissed it as a cheap trinket. They didn't know that this man, this frail figure standing straight now only by willpower, had once commanded units whose names were never spoken in newspapers. That he had once built the supply routes that allowed entire campaigns to survive. That his service had stretched across oceans and deserts, recorded only in secret ledgers and whispered in the halls of strategy. They didn't know that until now, but they were about to. The salute still hung in the air when General Harlan stepped forward. Boots heavy with fury, eyes scanning the room like searchlights cutting through fog. His aide, silent and grim, followed with a steel case in hand. The bank lobby, once a theater of humiliation, had transformed into a courtroom, and every person present was both witness and accused. The verdict, however, had already been decided. Because this was not simply about a man retrieving money, this was about something larger, older, and far heavier. It was about forgotten promises, about loyalty spat on by those too young to know its price. It was about dignity, dignity forged in war and disgracefully dismissed in peace. And as Elijah Mercer stood beneath the fluorescent glow of that sterile bank, returning a salute that cracked the air like lightning, one truth became undeniable. This was not going to end the way Travis Holt thought it would. Not today. Not ever. 3 hours earlier, before boots and brass shattered the air, the morning was quiet. The kind of quiet Elijah Mercer both cherished and distrusted. His one-bedroom house on the outskirts of Denver had seen better days peeling paint, a gate that whined on its hinges, a porch light that hadn't worked in years. Inside, though, everything was neat, precise. The bed made with military corners, boots lined against the wall, a kitchen counter cleared except for a folded newspaper and a chipped mug of black coffee. Elijah rose before dawn, as he always had. Habit, not necessity. At 78, his knees ached, his lungs wheezed in the cold air, but his back remained straight. He moved with the deliberate slowness of someone who had learned that rushing only wastes energy. On the dresser sat 3 items laid out like a ritual. A frayed wool jacket, elbows worn thin but pressed flat. A black cap embroidered with faded gold thread. Korea, divided by Desert Storm veteran. And a small velvet pouch holding the silver challenge coin that had traveled with him across continents, deserts, and oceans. He picked up the coin first, always the coin. His fingers traced the eagle etched deep into its surface, the talons clutching arrows, the 7 stars circling overhead. It wasn't shiny anymore, time had rubbed it smooth, but it held weight beyond metal. That coin had once silenced a general mid-sentence. It had once been handed across a tent lit by red lamps on a night when failure meant hundreds dead. It was more than proof. It was identity. Elijah slipped it into his breast pocket, then buttoned his jacket. Today wasn't about honor, though. It wasn't about medals or coins or who remembered his name. It was about family. His granddaughter, Alina, had just been accepted into a nursing program. The tuition notice had come in the mail last week. Elijah hadn't told her he still had an old account at Rocky Heights Bank, a place he hadn't set foot in since the 1,990 seconds, when it had been little more than a community branch. That account held the hazard pay from deployments no one in Congress had ever publicly acknowledged. The kind of missions stamped and buried under classified, forgotten by the government but not by him. It wasn't much anymore, not compared to today's numbers, but it was enough to cover her first year, enough to keep a promise. He brushed his cap clean with the side of his hand, pressed the brim, and placed it carefully on his head. By 9 a.m., Elijah Mercer stepped out into the Colorado chill. The bus ride was long, crowded with office workers scrolling through glowing screens, teenagers blasting music from earbuds, and tired mothers clutching grocery bags. Elijah sat in silence, hat on his knee, cane leaning against his leg. No one spoke to him. No one asked about the coin-shaped bulge pressing faintly against his jacket. To them, he was just another old man taking up space. When the bus hissed to a halt downtown, Elijah rose slowly, descended the steps, and walked toward the gleaming glass facade of Rocky Heights Bank. The building hadn't always been a bank. Once, it had been part of Summit Command Installation, a hub during the Cold War, designed and overseen by Elijah himself when he was still a colonel in the Corps of Engineers. He had drawn the lines that became the foundations of supply corridors stretching halfway across the world. He knew every inch of this ground, though now marble tiles and security scanners covered it. The irony wasn't lost on him. He paused at the entrance, removed his cap, and brushed it again. Then he stepped inside. The lobby was bright, sterile, smelling faintly of burnt coffee from a machine in the corner. A long line snaked toward the counter, where tellers in blue shirts tapped at keyboards without looking up. A television mounted on the wall scrolled headlines about markets and politics. Elijah joined the line, cane in hand, shoulders squared. He waited patiently, the way men from his era always did. Waiting wasn't punishment, it was discipline. Minutes ticked by, The line shifted forward. At last, Elijah reached the counter. The teller, a young woman with glossy nails and eyes already tired from the morning rush, glanced at him briefly. Then at the worn papers he unfolded onto the desk. A VA card, two discharge papers yellowed at the edges, and his ID. Her brow furrowed. "This account's been inactive for decades," she said, her tone uncertain. "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied softly. His voice carried the gravel of age, but also the steadiness of command. "But I'd like to withdraw a portion today." She hesitated. Fingers tapped across her keyboard. Something on the screen made her pause. I'll need to get my manager." Elijah gave a polite nod. From a glass office near the back, Travis Holt emerged. He looked like the world had never once told him no. Hair slicked into place, tie too short, suit cut sharp but cheap. He walked with the confidence of someone who mistook authority for superiority. Travis picked up the papers, scanned them, and chuckled. Not the laugh of humor, but the laugh of insult. "You sure this account is yours, sir?" he asked, dragging the word out like a joke. "These forms look like they were typed on a dinosaur." The teller smiled nervously, glancing between them. Elijah didn't flinch. He simply reached into his jacket, pulled out the silver coin, and placed it gently on the counter. The coin caught the light, its eagle flashing for a moment before settling into shadow. Travis leaned in, squinted, and smirked. "Cute trinket. Anybody can buy these online." The teller laughed softer this time, almost involuntary. Elijah said nothing. Travis waved towards security. "Get this man out of here. Another wannabe vet trying to game the system." The guard hesitated. Just a second. Just long enough for Elijah to hear every word. Behind them, a teenager raised his phone, recording. A woman stifled a laugh. Another customer pretended not to see. Elijah picked up the coin with steady fingers, slid it back into his jacket, and walked to a bench by the window. He sat down, straight-backed, cane between his hands, eyes fixed not on the people around him but on the flag across the street, fluttering in the wind. The room filled with a silence colder than mockery. Something had shifted, though most couldn't name it, because Elijah Mercer wasn't broken. He was waiting, and men like him had been waiting their entire lives. The silence in the bank wasn't natural. It wasn't the soft hush of business as usual. It was jagged, uneasy, like the quiet after someone drops a glass and everyone waits to see if it's shattered. Travis Holt leaned against the counter, forcing a smirk back onto his lips. He thrived on performance on an audience, and even though the laughter had dulled, he wanted to keep control. "Folks, relax," he said, voice pitched just loud enough to reach the line of customers. "We get this kind of thing more than you'd think. People digging up old war stories trying to cash in. Happens all the time." The teller giggled nervously. A few customers glanced up from their phones, unsure whether to nod or cringe. Elijah Mercer remained seated. He hadn't so much as shifted in his seat since he'd set down his cane. His hands rested on the knob like it was a hilt, his posture regal in its stillness. Across the lobby, one pair of eyes didn't look away. Adriana Vega, early 30s, tall, with the posture of someone who'd carried weight on her shoulders, gear, rifles, responsibility. She wore a civilian blazer over jeans, but the squared set of her shoulders was unmistakable. Once a Marine logistics officer, now working defense contracts in the private sector, she knew what she'd just seen. That coin. Her mind snapped back years earlier to a conference room at Camp Lejeune where a retired JSOC colonel had walked in carrying a small box. He had placed a coin just like that one on the table, and every officer in the room had stood without needing to be told. It wasn't a trinket. It was a thunderclap in metal. Adriana's jaw tightened. She pushed through the line and planted herself in front of the counter, eyes drilling into Travis. "You just made a mistake," she said. Travis blinked. "Excuse me?" She pointed toward Elijah. "That man isn't a fake. That coin alone outranks every paycheck in this building." The room shifted again. People stopped pretending not to listen. A few glanced at the old man by the window with new curiosity, their expressions caught between doubt and discomfort. Travis let out a dry laugh, raising his hands like he was humoring a child. "If he's so important," Travis said, "why isn't someone here with him? Why isn't the Pentagon rolling out a red carpet?" Adriana didn't answer with words. She turned on her heel, stepped outside into the cold air, and pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered for only a second before she hit the number. "Mercer," she said into the receiver. Silver Eagle coin, Rocky Heights Bank. He's here. The voice on the other end, low, sharp, instantly alert, didn't waste time. You're certain? I saw it with my own eyes. Don't let him leave. The call ended. Adriana's heart hammered, not with fear but with anticipation. Something larger was already in motion, and she had just lit the fuse. Inside the bank, Elijah hadn't moved, but someone else had noticed. At the far end of the lobby, near a row of offices, a man in his late 60s adjusted his glasses. Leonard Price had worked at Rocky Heights Bank for 30 years. He was the kind of employee customers barely remembered, but who knew every detail of the bank's history. He had seen its transformation from a community credit branch into a polished downtown institution, and he had never forgotten the brass plaque that hung in the archive hallway. It was small, mostly ignored, dedicated decades earlier when the land had been converted from a military installation to a financial building. He could recite it from memory. In honor of those who established and defended Summit Command Installation, whose groundwork paved the future, Chief Engineer, Colonel Elijah Mercer. Leonard's stomach tightened. He stepped quietly into the back office, picked up the landline, and dialed a number he hadn't touched in years. The voice on the other end answered with a single word. Command. Leonard spoke 6. It's Bishop Coyne. Elijah Mercer. Here. The silence that followed was brief, but electric. Then, understood. The line went dead. Back in the lobby, Travis still paced, still smirking, though the unease around him was growing. Customers whispered. The teller no longer looked him in the eye. The security guard shifted, glancing at Elijah more often than at his boss. Elijah remained steady. He hadn't come here to start a war. He hadn't come for recognition. He had come to keep a promise to a granddaughter who had no idea of the weight he carried. But promises have a way of igniting fires, especially when they collide with arrogance. And in that sterile bank lobby, beneath the glow of fluorescent lights and the shadow of an American flag fluttering just outside, the match had already been struck. The air inside Rocky Heights Bank thickened with something that wasn't visible but was undeniable. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The hum of the HVAC system suddenly felt louder. Every sound was magnified, the soft scratch of pens, the muted clack of a keyboard, the nervous shuffle of a guard's boots. Elijah Mercer remained where he was, hands folded over the curved handle of his cane, posture perfectly upright. He did not fidget, did not plead, did not even look at the people who had mocked him minutes earlier. He only looked past the glass windows at the American flag across the street. The red and white stripes snapped in the wind, the blue field with its stars pulling against the gusts, and Elijah's eyes followed its rhythm as though that flag were the only thing still worth watching. To anyone else, he appeared passive. To those who understood, if any remained, his stillness radiated the same thing it had always meant in the field. Discipline. Men like him didn't explode without reason. They endured. And when the time came, they struck. But the crowd didn't see that. They only saw an old man with thinning gray hair, a cap too worn to be fashionable, and papers yellowed at the edges. Travis Holt leaned back against the counter, his smirk back in place now that Adriana had stepped outside. This is ridiculous, he muttered loudly, making sure customers heard. Probably hoping someone's streaming this so he can milk pity donations. Happens all the time. The teller glanced at him, her lips tightening, but she said nothing. Hell, Travis went on. I should have called the cops already. Would have been easier. He laughed, though this time fewer people joined in. It was then that Adriana re-entered the bank. Her face was calm, but her eyes blazed with a cold anger. She didn't look at Travis. She didn't even glance at Elijah. She simply returned to her spot against the wall, arms crossed, waiting. And the old archivist, Leonard Price, lingered by the hallway. His call was already made, his role already played. He too waited, though unlike the others, he knew precisely what was coming. Minutes crawled like hours. The tension didn't release, it coiled tighter. A woman in the corner who had giggled earlier now avoided looking at Elijah. The teenager who had been recording slipped his phone into his pocket, suddenly ashamed. Even the guard at the door stood straighter, his jaw working nervously. Travis kept moving, restless, like a man who had poured gasoline over a fire but hadn't realized it yet. Then, faint at first, came the sound. Boots. Not the shuffle of sneakers, not the polished click of dress shoes, but boots. Heavy, deliberate, pounding the marble floor in unison. The glass doors swung open hard, not with violence, but with authority. The entire lobby seemed to exhale at once, as if air had been sucked out and slammed back in. A man interred. He wasn't young. His hair was iron gray, his scar cutting across one cheek like a brand carved by history itself. His uniform was immaculate, a wall of ribbons gleaming across his chest, stars on his shoulders catching the fluorescent light and throwing it back with a glare. Behind him came an aide, silent, carrying a steel case like it contained judgment itself. The teller gasped. The guard froze. The customers instinctively rose, though none of them could explain why. Lieutenant General Marcus Harlan didn't look at them, didn't look at Travis, didn't look at Adriana, who stood taller now that she knew the cavalry had arrived. His eyes fixed on one point only. The bench by the window. The old man sitting in silence. Elijah Mercer. The general stopped in front of him. The boots silenced. The lobby became a cathedral. Then, in front of every eye, Marcus Harlan snapped to attention, hand slicing to his temple with a crack that echoed like thunder. He saluted. The sound of palm against visor was louder than any apology, sharper than any insult, final as a gunshot. The entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. Elijah lifted his eyes. For a moment, confusion flickered there, but slowly, as though decades melted away, he rose. His cane clicked against the marble, his knees straightened with effort, and his arm, though aged, rose with the precision of memory. He returned the salute, and in that single moment, the room split open. The arrogant laughter, the dismissive sneers, the condescension of ignorance, all of it died. Because the truth was now undeniable. This was no fraud. This was no beggar. This was Colonel Elijah Mercer. The silence after the salute was suffocating. No one dared breathe too loud, let alone speak. Even the televisions mounted high on the walls seemed to quiet, the news ticker rolling unseen. General Marcus Harlan lowered his hand with slow, deliberate precision, then turned his head, scanning the bank lobby. His eyes were cold steel, the kind that could cut through lies faster than a blade. "Who here," he said, his voice low but sharp enough to slice glass, "called Colonel Elijah Mercer a fraud?" The question hung like smoke. The teller shrank behind her monitor. The guard shifted his weight from one foot to the other, jaw clenched. Customers who had been whispering seconds earlier were suddenly fascinated by the floor. Travis Holt felt every pair of eyes land on him. He tried to hold on to the arrogance that had carried him through so many encounters, the smirk, the superiority, the belief that titles and suits gave him power. But under the gaze of Marcus Harlan, the weight of stars on his shoulders, Travis felt his mouth dry, his throat close. I didn't know," he stammered finally. His face had lost its color. "Of course you didn't," Harlan snapped, stepping closer. "Because ignorance is easy. Because mocking service you never gave is simple. Because men like you think age means weakness. You saw papers that looked old, and you laughed. You saw a coin you didn't understand, and you sneered. And in doing so, you spat on a man whose record built the very ground you stand on." Travis opened his mouth to reply, but no sound came out. The aide stepped forward then, setting the steel case on the counter. With a click, the latches opened, and the lid rose. Inside lay a folder stamped "Classified," a commemorative coin inset in velvet, and a glossy print of the brass plaque that still hung in the archive hallway of the bank, the plaque bearing Elijah Mercer's name. The teller gasped. Several customers leaned forward, reading the bold letters even from a distance. "Colonel Mercer," Harlan said, his voice shifting now, softer but no less commanding, "was instrumental in establishing engineering and logistics doctrines still used by every branch of our military. His record spans 2 wars, 6 theaters, and operations so sensitive they remain buried even today. His name isn't just on paper. It is carved into the foundations of this city, this country. And you?" He turned his eyes back to Travis. "Dared call him a fraud." Travis's knees nearly buckled. Adriana Vega, standing tall near the wall, allowed herself the faintest of smiles. She had seen arrogance crumble before, but never so completely. Elijah said nothing. He hadn't said anything since the general entered. He didn't need to. His silence was heavier than words. Finally, Harlan turned to him, the iron fury in his face softening. "Sir," the general said, his voice filled with something rare respect touched with apology. "If I had known you were in town sooner, I would have come myself." Elijah shifted slightly, leaning on his cane. His voice, when it came, was steady but weary. "Didn't come to be found. Just needed enough to help my granddaughter with school." The words, plain and unadorned, cut deeper than any speech. Here stood a man whose legacy spanned wars and continents, and all he asked was enough to keep a promise to a child. Harlan's jaw tightened. He gave a single nod. "Then let's make that happen." Together, the general and the colonel stepped toward the counter. Travis stumbled back, retreating behind the teller line like a boy caught stealing. His hands trembled. He wanted to protest, to salvage dignity, but there was none left to salvage. The laughter, the arrogance, the disdain, it had all been burned away in the heat of truth. The teller's hands shook as she processed the withdrawal, her eyes brimming with tears she couldn't explain. The receipt she printed felt heavier than paper when she handed it across the counter. Elijah accepted it with the same quiet dignity he had carried since walking in. He folded it once and slipped it into his pocket as though it were just another task completed. Not ceremony, not spectacle, just duty. But Marcus Harlan wasn't finished. He placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder, firm and grounding. "Colonel, you've got 5 minutes." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Harlan nodded toward the lobby. "For the honor you never asked for." And with that, the atmosphere of the bank shifted once more. Because as if compelled by something unseen, veterans scattered among the customers, a retired Navy corpsman by the deposit table, a young Army reservist near the ATM, a grizzled Air Force mechanic in line stood tall. Without a word, they raised their hands to their brows in salute. Civilians followed. Some stood stiffly, others awkwardly, but all rose. Not because they were ordered, not because they were told, but because something in the room demanded it. Travis's face drained further as he realized he was the only one still seated, still small in the shadow of greatness. And Elijah Mercer, who had entered that bank as an invisible man, now stood before them all as something more. Living proof that dignity doesn't age, doesn't fade, and cannot be mocked into silence. Elijah Mercer did not move at first. He stood quietly, cane in one hand, receipt folded neatly in his pocket, eyes lowered, as the entire room shifted around him. The veterans saluting, the civilians rising, it was more than spectacle. It was gravity. For a moment, he seemed lost in disbelief. For years, he had been invisible. Just another aging man on a bus. Just another name forgotten in files locked away in basements. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't asked for it. And yet, here it was. Slowly, he raised his head. His eyes swept across the room, the young reservist with trembling fingers still locked to his temple, the old corpsman standing straighter than his spine allowed, the civilians mimicking the gesture with awkward reverence. His gaze lingered finally on Travis Holt, still frozen behind the counter, pale as parchment. Elijah raised his hand, crisp despite the ache in his joints, and returned the salute. The sound of breath exhaled filled the room. General Harlan let the silence hang before speaking again, his voice low, each word cutting with deliberate precision. "You all look at this man now," Harlan said, turning to the onlookers, "because you nearly laughed him out of the very building that exists because of his command." Colonel Mercer oversaw the construction of Summit Command Installation in the 1,970 seconds, the foundation upon which this city's defense infrastructure was built. The bank you stand in profits off land he secured, supply lines he designed, and policies he wrote. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Leonard Price, the archivist, stood by the hallway, nodding faintly. He had known, but hearing it spoken aloud by a 3-star general made the truth heavier, undeniable. Harlan gestured to his aide, who retrieved something else from the steel case. A small velvet box. He held it out to Elijah. "We've been holding this for years," Harlan said. "Waiting for the right time. I think you'll want it now." Elijah hesitated before taking it. His thumb pressed the latch, and the lid lifted with a soft click. Inside lay a medal. Polished silver, engraved with 3 words, "Duty without witness." Elijah's breath caught, though he hid it well. That phrase, it was not public, not ceremonial. It was whispered only among men who had bled in places no map acknowledged. It was a recognition reserved for those who carried burdens no one else would ever see. For a long time, he stared at it. No tears, no trembling, only a slow nod, as though some door inside him, one he had locked decades ago, had finally been closed. "I didn't come here to be remembered," he murmured, voice rough, almost too soft to hear. "I came to keep a promise." Harlan's face softened. "And in doing so, Colonel, you reminded us all what service really means." The room was still. Then, unexpectedly, one of the civilians spoke. A woman in her 20s, clutching a checkbook, eyes wet. "My father? He was in Desert Storm," she said quietly. "He never talked about it, but thank you." Another voice followed. "My uncle served with engineers in Kuwait," a man added, his voice trembling. "He used to talk about a commander named Mercer, said he saved lives." The realization rippled outward. This wasn't just some forgotten veteran. This was a man whose shadow touched their families, their histories, whether they had known it or not. Travis, unable to withstand the weight, tried to speak again. His voice cracked. I didn't know. Of course you didn't," Harlan cut him off, steel returning to his tone. "Because you never asked. Because you never cared. That's the disease we're fighting now, isn't it? Indifference. Arrogance. A nation too busy laughing at its elders to remember who bled for its comfort." The words landed heavy. No one moved to defend Travis. Elijah closed the velvet box and slipped it gently into his jacket pocket, beside the silver coin. Two weights, two truths. Both his to carry. The teller, her hands trembling, tears welling despite herself, whispered, "I'm sorry." Elijah didn't respond. Not out of anger, simply because he didn't need to. His work here was done. General Harlan stood beside him, not as a superior, not as a rescuer, but as a soldier at his colonel's side. Together, they turned toward the doors. And as they walked out into the sunlight, no cameras followed, no reporters swarmed. But inside the bank, every person who had witnessed the morning would never forget it. Later that week, just as quietly as it began, a new line was etched into the brass plaque in the hallway. Beneath the original dedication, in bold letters, appeared, "Cole. Elijah Mercer, honor beyond silence." It did not name the incident. It did not mention the general. But everyone who worked at Rocky Heights Bank knew. And now, every time a customer stepped through those gleaming glass doors, they saw the name of the man they had nearly laughed into dust. The sunlight outside the bank was blinding after the heavy stillness inside. Elijah Mercer paused at the threshold, cane steady in one hand, velvet box pressing against his chest beneath his jacket. The air was crisp, mountain cold, and it filled his lungs with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. General Harlan remained beside him, hands clasped behind his back, uniform gleaming in the morning light. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between the two men was its own language, the kind forged on training grounds and battlefields, where words were unnecessary and respect was everything. Elijah lifted his eyes toward the flagpole across the street. The stars and stripes snapped hard against the wind, pulling, resisting, yet never tearing. He watched it for a long moment. "Funny," Elijah said finally, voice low, rough. "I used to stand guard under one of those. Kuwait, 91. Thought I'd never come home. Thought the sand would bury me. But the wind kept that flag up, no matter how black the sky got." Harlan turned his head, listening. "They laughed at me in there," Elijah continued, "like I was a ghost that didn't matter anymore. Truth is, ghosts don't matter until they do." Harlan's jaw tightened. He wanted to promise Elijah that men like him would always matter, but even generals knew the truth. Memory fades. Records vanish. Names get buried under the dust of bureaucracy and convenience. Today was proof of that. Instead, he said only, "Ghosts like you built this country. Without you, there's nothing left to laugh in." Elijah gave a faint smile, then let it fade. "I didn't come for recognition. I came for her." "Your granddaughter," Harlan said. Elijah nodded. "Alina, first in the family to go to college. Wants to be a nurse, wants to help people, the way I couldn't always." His eyes drifted back to the flag. "My pay was meant to cover her future before she was even born. Promised her father, my boy, I'd make sure she had it." Harlan said nothing. The mention of Elijah's son was a wound no one dared touch. Everyone knew he had died young, not in combat, but in a highway accident stateside. A cruel twist of fate. The colonel who survived wars only to bury his own child. And so the promise had shifted, resting now on Alina's shoulders, carried through Elijah's stubborn devotion. Behind them, the bank doors opened briefly. Adriana Vega stepped out. She crossed to Elijah, stood at attention for a heartbeat, and then extended her hand. "Sir," she said. Her voice trembled despite her effort to steady it. I just want to thank you for everything, for all of us." Elijah studied her. He saw not just the polished civilian she was now, but the soldier she had been, the discipline in her stance, the weight behind her eyes. He took her hand firmly. "You served," he said, more statement than question. "Yes, Colonel," she replied. "Marine Corps, logistics." A flicker of recognition touched his face. "Then you know. The real battles aren't in the headlines. They're in the supply lines, in the silence, in the weight nobody sees." Adriana's throat tightened. She nodded. "Yes, sir." Harlan broke the moment, his voice cutting in like a command. "Colonel Mercer." Elijah turned. "You're not alone anymore," Harlan said. "You may have walked in there invisible, but after today, the right people will remember. I'll make damn sure of it." Elijah didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "You'll forget me tomorrow. Everyone will. That's the way of things." "Not this time," Harlan said. The steel in his tone was unshakable. "Not with me." Elijah gave a small nod. He tapped his cane once against the pavement, then looked out toward the street. Cars passed by, drivers oblivious to what had just transpired inside Rocky Heights Bank. To them, it was just another day. But for those who had seen, those who had laughed and then fallen silent, those who had saluted without being asked, it would never be just another day again. Adriana remained at his side, as though unwilling to leave until she was sure the old soldier was safe. Harlan stood like a sentinel, eyes scanning the horizon. And Elijah Mercer, the man they had nearly dismissed as a fraud, simply breathed deep, as if the world had granted him one more day to keep the promises that mattered most. The ride home was quieter than the ride in. Elijah Mercer sat by the bus window, cane propped against his leg, cap folded in his lap. Outside, the Denver streets rolled by glass towers catching the sun, delivery trucks clogging intersections, young men and women rushing across crosswalks with phones glued to their palms. None of them looked at him. None of them knew. The velvet box pressed against his chest beneath the jacket, heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. He hadn't opened it again. He didn't need to. The words etched on the metal, "duty without witness," echoed in his mind like a mantra. He closed his eyes, and the memories rushed in. Sandstorms in Kuwait, 1991. Convoys stalled because one bridge hadn't been built right, one supply line hadn't been cleared. Men stranded in heat so brutal their rifles seared skin to the touch. He remembered crawling under armored vehicles, welding plates with his own hands while artillery thundered in the distance. He remembered voices over radios screaming coordinates that never reached the evening news. And further back, Korea, the frozen ridges, the smell of cordite and blood mixing in air so cold it cracked your lungs. He remembered men who had no graves, whose names he still whispered at night when sleep betrayed him. All of it, decades buried, now burned hot behind his eyelids. The bus jolted to a stop, and Elijah's eyes snapped open. Alina, his granddaughter, was waiting outside his house, backpack slung over one shoulder, hair tied back, excitement written all over her young face. She waved when she saw him step off the bus. "Grandpa," she called. Elijah felt his heart ease for the first time that day. He raised his hand in a small wave and walked carefully toward her. His knees hurt, his back protested, but his stride carried something steadier now, as if the salute in the bank had poured steel back into his spine. "Did it go okay?" Alina asked, concern flickering in her eyes. Elijah managed a smile. "Got what I needed." She hugged him, the kind of hug that carried no awareness of history, no knowledge of the wars that had scarred his body. To her, he wasn't a colonel. He wasn't a forgotten hero. He was just Grandpa. And that was enough. Inside, he handed her the folded receipt. First semester's tuition. Paid in full. Her eyes widened. "Grandpa, how?" "Doesn't matter how," Elijah said softly. "What matters is you go, you finish, and you do what I couldn't." She frowned. "What do you mean?" Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket and withdrew the velvet box. He placed it on the table between them. Alina opened it slowly. Her breath caught when she saw the metal gleaming inside. "What's this?" she whispered. "Something they kept," Elijah said. "Something I never asked for. But it's yours to see now. A reminder. Service isn't about medals. It's about keeping promises." Alina's fingers brushed the silver, tracing the words engraved. Duty without witness. Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't understand. Why wouldn't they give this to you before?" Elijah leaned back in his chair, staring at the quiet walls of his modest home. "Because sometimes the country we fight for forgets us. Sometimes it buries us under paperwork and silence. But today," he paused, searching for the right words. Today, for a moment, they remembered. Alina closed the box gently, holding it with both hands. She looked at her grandfather, really looked, and for the first time, she saw more than the old man with a cane. She saw the soldier behind his eyes, the battles carved into his silence. "I'll never forget," she said firmly. Elijah smiled faintly, the lines on his face softening. "That's all I need." But as night settled and Alina left to study, Elijah sat alone at the table, the silver coin in one hand, the velvet box in the other. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder if perhaps the ghosts he carried had finally been given their rest. That night, Denver slept. But Elijah Mercer did not. He sat in his armchair, the coin and the medal resting side by side on the table next to him. The television flickered, sound muted, replaying endless loops of political debates and market reports. He wasn't watching. His gaze was fixed on the two objects that defined the weight of his life, one earned in silence, the other bestowed too late. The words on the medal, "duty without witness," kept circling in his mind. He could still hear General Harlan's voice, cutting through the bank lobby like thunder. Who here called Colonel Elijah Mercer a fraud? Elijah had faced enemy fire, collapsing bridges, and operations buried in code names no civilian would ever hear. But never had he felt so raw, so exposed, as he had under the fluorescent lights of Rocky Heights Bank. To be mocked in the very building that stood on the bones of his service, that wound cut deeper than any shrapnel. Yet it was not humiliation that haunted him now. It was the memory of those who weren't there to see what happened. Men like Stafford, who had frozen to death on a Korean ridge while Elijah scribbled coordinates into the snow with numb fingers. Men like Morales, whose last laugh echoed over desert winds before silence swallowed it forever. Men like Jensen, who built bridges with him under artillery fire, only to vanish in a night raid, never acknowledged in history books. They had no medals, no plaques, no salutes in bank lobbies decades later. "Duty without witness," Elijah whispered to the empty room. "It was theirs before it was mine." The clock ticked past midnight. A knock came at the door. Elijah stiffened, cane already in hand as he rose slowly. At this hour, visitors meant trouble or urgency. He shuffled to the door and pulled it open. On the porch stood Adriana Vega. No blazer this time. She wore a dark jacket, her expression unreadable, but her eyes burned with intensity. "Colonel?" she said softly, almost like a password. Elijah frowned. "It's late, I know, but I couldn't leave it like that." She glanced past him, spotting the medal on the table inside. "I served under commanders who never came home. Men who talked about you. About the engineering doctrine that kept convoys alive in Kuwait. About the silent colonel who built lifelines through hell." Elijah's grip on his cane tightened. "Stories." "No," Adriana said firmly. "Legacy." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind rustled the trees in the yard, carrying the distant sound of a passing train. Finally, Elijah stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, she sat across from him at the table, her eyes fixed on the coin and medal. "You know what that moment in the bank meant, don't you?" she asked. Elijah shook his head. "A show, nothing more. Tomorrow, those people will go back to their lives, forget I was ever there." Adriana leaned forward. "Not everyone. You didn't see it, but some of them recorded. Word's already spreading. They're calling it the salute in Denver." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "I didn't want headlines." "I know. But you've started something bigger than you realize." He sighed, weary. "I'm not interested in movements. I'm interested in promises, and I've kept mine. Adriana studied him carefully. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "What if the world still needs you?" Elijah looked at her sharply. He saw something in her expression, not flattery, not sentiment, but conviction. The coin gleamed faintly in the lamplight, as if answering for him. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "Then God help the world," he said, "because all it has left are ghosts." Adriana didn't look away. "Maybe," she replied, "but sometimes ghosts are exactly what we need." The phrase lingered in the air, "Ghosts are exactly what we need." Elijah Mercer didn't answer right away. He simply sat back, the cane across his knees, eyes fixed on the metal and the coin glinting under the lamp. The house felt too small for the weight of that conversation. Adriana leaned forward, elbows on the table, her voice low but steady. "Sir, I know you don't want attention. You don't want cameras or speeches. But what happened today wasn't just about you. It was about every soldier who came back and was forgotten, about every promise broken when the uniform came off. You saw the looks in that bank. You saw how fast laughter turned into shame. That moment mattered." Elijah rubbed his thumb along the cane's handle. His silence wasn't refusal, it was calculation. That was how he had always operated. No wasted words, no wasted moves. Finally, he asked, "Why are you here, really?" Adriana swallowed. For a moment, her composure cracked, and he saw not the civilian contractor, not the Marine officer she used to be, but the woman beneath all of it. "Because I watched my father waste away after Afghanistan. Because I watched a man who once carried steel in his spine die with no one at his bedside except me. Because no one saluted him at the end." Her voice trembled but hardened again. "I won't let that keep happening." The old colonel's eyes softened. He leaned forward now, matching her intensity. "Then what do you want from me?" Adriana hesitated. Then, "Help me. Not with speeches, not with politics, with presence, with the weight of who you are, with the truth they can't ignore." Elijah gave a humorless chuckle. "You think a frail old man with a cane is going to change a system that's built on forgetting?" She shook her head. "No, I think a colonel with a coin and a medal they tried to bury already did." The words cut through him sharper than shrapnel ever had. Elijah's gaze drifted back to the coin. He remembered the night it had been given to him not in ceremony, but in secrecy, passed across a folding table in a desert tent. The commander had said only one thing: "You'll know when to use it." Had that moment come today, or was there still something left? The room felt heavier. His ghost pressed in, the names of men lost echoing in the silence. For the first time in years, he didn't push them away. He let them linger. "Ghosts," he muttered again, almost to himself. Adriana leaned closer. "Maybe ghosts are all we need to remind the living what they've forgotten." Elijah looked up sharply, his eyes blazing with something Adriana hadn't seen before, not weariness, but resolve. "You really think the world's ready to listen?" he asked. Adriana's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but I know it can't afford to keep ignoring you." A long silence stretched between them. Then Elijah tapped his cane once against the floor, a sound like a gavel striking wood. "If I do this," he said slowly, "it won't be for glory. It won't be for headlines. It'll be for the ones who never came home, the ones whose names never made plaques or medals." Adriana nodded firmly. "That's the only reason it should be done." Elijah studied her one last time, as if weighing the weight of her soul. Then he extended his hand. "Then we start," he said. She gripped it tightly. Outside, the wind howled through the Denver streets, rattling windows and carrying with it the faint echo of a flag flapping in the night. And inside that small house, two people sat across from one another. One young, one old, one living, one half-ghost, forging a pact that would ripple far beyond the walls that contained it. By dawn, Elijah Mercer hadn't slept. He sat in his chair, staring at the thin line of sunlight crawling across the floorboards. The cane rested against the armrest, the medal and the coin laid out neatly on the table before him. Adriana had left a few hours earlier, but her words lingered like the smoke of a battlefield. Maybe ghosts are all we need. For years, Elijah had told himself his fight was finished. He had survived Korea, endured Desert Storm, carried burdens no one else wanted to touch. He had buried friends, a son, and pieces of himself. He had paid his debt 100 times over. But the look on Travis Holt's face, the smug arrogance curdling into fear, stayed with him. So did the silence of the bank when General Harlan's salute cracked through the room. That silence was not just shame. It was recognition. The world still needed men like him, even if it didn't know it. The knock came again, just as it had the night before. This time, Elijah was ready. General Marcus Harlan stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. He looked as though he hadn't slept either. His uniform was still sharp, but his eyes were bloodshot, his jaw set hard. "Elijah," he said, his voice flat, stripped of ceremony. "Marcus," Elijah replied. They didn't waste time with ranks when the walls were this thin. The general sat heavily in the opposite chair. For a moment, the two men said nothing, the silence carrying the weight of decades of shared history. Finally, Harlan broke it. "You stirred something yesterday, bigger than either of us expected." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "I didn't stir anything. I sat quietly until you walked in." Harlan let out a humorless laugh. "That's the point. You did nothing, and the whole damn internet is on fire. They're calling you the ghost colonel. Clips of the salute are everywhere. Congressmen are tweeting about honor and respect like they just discovered the words exist." Elijah grimaced. "I didn't ask for that." "I know." Harlan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "But it's here, and the machine won't stop now. You can either let them twist it into another slogan or—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Or you can take control of it." Elijah tapped his cane against the floor, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "You want me to be a symbol. I want you to be a reminder," Harlan corrected. "A reminder that service doesn't expire, that dignity doesn't age, that the promises we made to our own still matter." Elijah's gaze fell on the coin. The silver eagle gleamed faintly in the sunlight. "You'll know when to use it." That's what the commander had told him all those years ago. He looked back at Harlan. "You're asking me to step into the fire again, to fight a different kind of war." Harlan didn't flinch. "Yes." The old colonel leaned back, exhaling slowly. He thought of Alina, of her wide eyes as she held the medal the night before. He thought of the plaque in the bank, the names etched in brass, the men who had never come home to see theirs. Finally, Elijah said, "If I do this, I won't do it for politicians. I won't do it for bankers or generals. I'll do it for them." He tapped the medal with one finger. "For the ones who carry duty without witness." Harlan nodded. "That's all I could hope for." The two men sat in silence again, but it was different now, less heavy, more resolved. When Harlan finally stood to leave, he placed a firm hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Ghosts don't fade, Colonel. They haunt. And sometimes haunting is exactly what a country needs." After the general left, Elijah remained in his chair, staring at the coin and the medal. The decision had already been made. For the first time in decades, the old soldier felt the weight of purpose settle onto his shoulders again. It was heavy. It was familiar. And it was welcome. The next week was unlike anything Elijah Mercer had ever known. He had expected the firestorm to die quickly, like so many fleeting stories do. But it didn't. The video from Rocky Heights Bank spread like wildfire, the salute, the confrontation, the moment the room shifted from laughter to reverence. Clips replayed across news channels, cut with dramatic music and scrolling headlines. "The Ghost Colonel." Hashtags trended. Veterans from every branch flooded social media with stories of forgotten comrades, of quiet service unacknowledged. But for Elijah, none of that mattered. He stayed in his modest house, walking the same quiet halls, polishing the same old cap, sipping his black coffee. He didn't want the attention. He didn't need it. And yet, he couldn't deny it. Something had changed. Letters began arriving. Not emails, not tweets, letters. Handwritten, folded, mailed. From families of men he'd once served with. From strangers who said his story made them remember their own fathers and grandfathers differently. From young soldiers who had felt invisible until they saw him stand tall again. Each one weighed as much as the medal in his pocket. Alina sat at the table one evening, helping him open the envelopes. Her eyes were wide as she read the words aloud. "You don't know me, Colonel Mercer, but because of you, I finally understand why my dad never talked about his service. Thank you." Another letter said, "They tried to make you invisible, but you reminded us all what respect looks like." Elijah listened, silent as always, but his hand trembled when he placed the letters into a neat stack. Later that week, Rocky Heights Bank quietly unveiled a new addition to their brass plaque. Beneath the dedication to Summit Command installation, a single new line was etched. Cole. Elia Mercer Honor, beyond silence. There was no press release, no ceremony, just a quiet change. But the employees saw it every morning when they walked in. Customers paused to read it. And those who had been present that day, the teller, the guard, even Travis Holt, now demoted and transferred to a smaller branch, felt the weight of it every time their eyes skimmed those words. For Elijah, it wasn't vindication. It wasn't victory. It was simply recognition of what should have never been forgotten. One evening, Alina found him sitting on the porch, cap in hand, watching the flag at the end of the block. "You okay, Grandpa?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "I'm all right. You think it's over now?" she asked. Elijah smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both sadness and pride. "For me, maybe. But for the ones still out there? For the ones nobody remembers? No, it's never over." Alina sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. The silence between them was peaceful, not heavy. Inside, on the table, the coin and the medal lay side by side. Two symbols of a life lived in service. One given in secrecy, the other given too late. Together, they told the story of a man who never asked to be remembered, but who reminded the world anyway. And in that small Denver house, as the flag rippled against the evening sky, Elijah Mercer whispered to himself the truth that had carried him through every battlefield, every silence, every humiliation, and every honor. "I kept the promise.